I wanted to kind of focus in on the discrepancy between what the FBI has reported and what the CPRC had found, and kind of dive into what some of those discrepancies are, what they were caused by. So there's two main factors at play here. One is that the FBI completely misclassified shootings. So they had, correctly classified something as a mass shooting, and then they had completely forgotten to mention that a civilian was involved in thwarting the attack.
Wow.
Yeah. So there were multiple cases like that. There were a couple cases where they actually said it was armed security personnel, but it turned out that it was just a civilian at church that happened to carry a gun, things like that. So just some misclassifications. But then the FBI also overlooked a ton of incidents, and they just did not include them at all whatsoever in any of their reports. The FBI actually in writing, and Dr. Lott talks about this in his study, the FBI in writing said, yes, you're right, this and that and this and that do fall under the same definition that we used when we came up with these numbers, and they should have been included. They were just missed. So the FBI acknowledged it, said, yes, you're right, these are actually, meeting our active shooter definition.
Which is probably the best you can hope for from a huge federal conglomerate,
Yeah.
Okay, fine. You should have, but, whatever.
But they publish these reports once a year. Yeah. So why not make an amendment and include the ones that were missed, right? So they've never included any of them, even though they've admitted that they have missed all of these. There's also another agency that's related to a university in Texas that has done a lot of research on these, active shooting events and how they're getting stopped. And they've also misclassified things, saying that the police actually stopped the shooting when, in fact, a civilian stopped the shooting, but a police officer is who apprehended the shooter at the end. So they counted police apprehension, like arresting the bad guy, as stopping the attack, even though the civilian had stopped the attack, 20 minutes prior in that case.
Right.
So there's just all sorts of misclassifications going on. But last week or 2 weeks ago, we had talked about the concept of media misrepresenting these situations. We saw it a lot with the Dickens shooting in Indiana at that mall. All the headlines were talking about, how rare it is for civilians to stop active shootings and all of this. And I had mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we need to fight back against that blind belief that that's true. And I think one way that we can all do that is by sharing when we hear about an active shooting incident that is stopped by an armed citizen. Let's share that on our social media. Let's put that out there. Let's, talk to our friends about it, mention it to people, because the media is not going to do it for us.
Right.
We have to do it for ourselves if we want those stories to get out there. And the CPRC makes it really easy for you. You can go to this study, you can click on the link. There's over 100 cases with media, small newspapers in the hometown and stuff like that, talking about these cases. And you can share those on your social media. You can write something up on Facebook and share it with your friends. But I think we can't rely on the mainstream media to be actually reporting on these, even though these are exactly the types of things that we can hope to see from a well-regulated militia, right? We want people to be carrying guns and to be stopping violent crimes and saving their own lives and saving the lives of others. We all want that.
Yeah. What do you think? Is there a motivation, or do you think it's just a different motivation that the FBI has when they're compiling these numbers? And do you think that motivation has reason? Does it? Are they trying to be anti-gun, or are they just like, hey, we have different priorities here. We're trying to accomplish a different task. Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, to your point earlier, they're a huge conglomerate, right? So whether or not they can actually make all these amendments and stuff, maybe that's a little bit beyond their scope. But what the CPRC found was that almost every case where they just kind of omitted the situation because they said it was like a domestic violence dispute or something like that, almost every single one of those leaned the other direction.
Oh,
so
interesting.
There were 14 cases that they found that the CPRC would argue was not a domestic dispute. So like an active shooter walked into a barber shop and shoots the armed civilian's wife. The armed civilian draws his firearm, shoots the active shooter, and they classified that one as a domestic dispute just because his wife had gotten shot in the altercation. It wasn't a domestic dispute at all. There was no domestic anything. They just happened to both be in public at the same time when a bad guy came in. So,
well, you know what? Let's take it back. I got to tell you, if we take it back to the guy that we were talking about earlier, what's his name?
Kellerman?
Kellerman.
Yeah.
So in that situation, so let's tie both of these together real quick. In that situation, say a guy walked in with a knife into a barbershop, stabbed a guy's wife, and the husband, was armed legally and shot and killed the guy who was wielding the knife. Kellerman would say, see, this is why guns are bad. That's how, you know what I mean? Yeah. Because a gun was there, she got stabbed, which is exactly why. So these things matter. And I got to tell you, I've thought for years, if you look at what they call mass shootings, which are really mass murders is what they are.
Yeah.
They add the word shooting in there, maybe for context, but probably more for political reasons. But if you look at it, there are really a few different versions of it. There's somebody who's clearly insane, and they go to a public place that's over 90% of the time is a gun-free zone, and they start killing people for the sake of killing people. There's a student at a school who's disgruntled or maybe also has mental health issues, and that person shoots up his own school or I don't think their own school, maybe him, maybe her. That's a totally different situation. And then there's like workplace violence, where somebody shoots up the place where they're working. There's gang violence where someone shoots their rival gang members. There's domestic violence where somebody kills people in their own family. It's important to distinguish between these because the solutions are extremely different.
yes.
And the reality is the anti-gunners, they have one solution, which is take away guns.
Which isn't a solution at all. It's not solving the problem.
In no way is it solving the problem. But what they're doing is they're using these, they're bunching them all into one, and saying, hey, look at how big this problem is. When it's really 5, 6, 7, 8, medium-sized problems, for lack of a better term. And I've long thought that, we should probably come up with a series of terms that really better educates people as to what exactly happened.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
Now, I found a graphic. I can't speak to the facts of the numbers. I don't know if these are legit, right, or accurate, and that's not the point of this. But I would love to see facts given more in the detail of the way this is. It's a bit of a flow chart. The source for this comes from Alert Center, and Alert is ALERRT, just to give the source. It is titled "Who Stops the Bad Guy with a Gun?" and it's created by Larry Buchanan and Lauren Weatherby, dated June 22nd of 2022. So that's the information given on this graphic. And what it is, it breaks it down. There were 433 active shooting numbers provided. Of those, 249 attacks ended before the police arrived. 184 ended after the police arrived, and they further break these things down. I think this would be very beneficial. Of those 249 that ended before police arrived, 185 ended with the attacker leaving the scene or dying by suicide. 64 were ended by the bystander either subduing or taking that shot and rendering that attacker. And they no longer do attack. And then they further broke that down. How many were citizens, security guards, or off-duty officers? These facts. I can't speak to the numbers being legit.
Yeah.
However, the flow and the breakdown, I think, would be greatly beneficial.
Now imagine if each one of those had its own specific term.
Right.
Because right now, when you say there were 200 school shootings last year, or whatever the number is, 199 of them may have been, criminals killing criminals on school property after hours. You know what I mean? Or within the perimeter of a school. It might even be a mile away from a school. That's not a school shooting.
So that is actually where the FBI gets their data. The FBI contracts out this work to compile the mass shooting data to the Advanced Law Enforcement Rapid Response Training Center at TSU. So that university, that Texas university I referenced earlier that is incorrect in how many shootings it found, that's that same thing that you're just looking at right now. I love the way the data is shown. They're just I think probably intentionally, miscategorizing shootings.
Well, you know what's are they just using their data, or are they actually analyzing the FBI? Do you know if they're actually altering the data?
So the FBI contracts out the work. The Texas State University Center sends it back to the FBI, and then the FBI reviews and refines the findings.
Because I'm just wondering if, it might not be some FBI guy, who's doing the mistake. It might be academia who may not be as pure science as we wish they were.
Well, and the CPRC discovered lots of cases that the Texas University Center had missed.
Well, that's interesting.
And then the CPRC reached out to the center and said, "Hey, here's some cases." And there are back and forth emails that Dr. John Lott has with them, basically where they're saying they've done their best. They missed some things, but they did their best, kind of.
Maybe with new leadership in the executive branch, maybe with new leadership at the federal DOJ, we can correct some of those mistakes or oversights or whatever. I don't know. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they are just mistakes. Texas.
But
it's Texas, so who knows? No. What's
part
that,
of the
Sam?
issue with trying to track these things is that it's very, very time consuming to go through all of these reports, because this isn't the source is qualitative data, and you have to refine it and break it down into quantitative data. And so what I mean by that is that you can't just classify the kind of thing we're talking about. You can't generate these classifications just by looking at numbers and doing math with numbers. You have to have someone sit down and read news reports and police reports from every single incident and go through and mentally figure out, use heuristics to figure out, okay, here is how we're going to classify this according to these written criteria, not just figuring out percentages and that sort of thing. So again, it's very time consuming. So almost no one has the resources to even be able to do it, because like if any of us in this room, in this virtual room, I guess, wanted to do this for ourselves, we wouldn't be doing our real jobs. We would be spending weeks and weeks, if not months, out of every year, not doing the things that put food on the table, just trying to figure out how to classify these incidents.
Excellent point.
Well, I think the difference here is that the center at TSU is getting paid millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to compile this data,
money.
right?
Yeah.
So they are getting, putting food on the table to do this. But I think the point stands that it's a person who is looking at this particular shooting and trying to determine if it meets this criteria or that criteria, and then putting it in the correct bucket. And maybe it's not even a conscious bias thing. Maybe it's an unconscious bias that particular person has of, a civilian stopped the shooting, so somewhere in the back of my head I'm going to rationalize why this particular shooting doesn't meet this definition. So it may not even be intentional, but that doesn't change the fact that the data is biased in one direction.
Right.
It's not mistakes on both sides. There's 14 different cases that the FBI included in the report that are clearly domestic disputes, but the difference is that all 14 of those were stopped by police.
Excellent information, good discussion. I think it's all extremely interesting. I think there's probably more that we'll dig into in this study. It really is just a wealth of information. So check it out. It's what's the name of the organization? It's John Lott's organization, which is
The Federalist.
Center for Policy Research. No, sorry. CPRC. I don't know.
The Federalist.com actually
the article.
produced it, or I'm not produced it, published it, but the organization that produced
Crime
it.
Prevention Research Center.
Crime Prevention Research Center, which is John Lott, which is awesome. Hey, thanks for watching Gun Owners Radio. I hope you loved that clip. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and follow us on social media, and check out our website at gunownersradio.com.